Mr. J.C. Boggs, partner, King and Spalding, and member of my board.
That was excellent presentation. And what I hear out of this is the green economy is basically driving the red economy, right? And through EVs and in wind and solar, most of that manufacturing is in China. I'm going to touch a little bit on that in the context of critical minerals. I think unlike our other panelists, I'm not an energy expert, and I got into this issue sort of circuitously through my work in election integrity. Until recently, I served on the Board of Elections in Washington, D.C. I've been working in election integrity issues for 20, 25 years now, but was engaged to help ensure free, fair, and inclusive elections in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and working with the United States administration and U.S. Congress to ensure, do what we can to make sure that happened through funding sources and support of NGOs, working closely with religious organizations, NGOs, Catholic Church in DRC. And I found very quickly that while there's interest in election integrity, it wasn't all that significant interest. So what could I do to make it, sort of drive it home? Why should they care about election integrity in halfway across the world in DRC? And why should Congress care? Why should the administration care? And there was really 2 points I tried to make. One is human rights. And particularly in Congress, we were able to appeal to some members of Congress, particularly on the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, led by Chris Smith. And he held 2 hearings on human rights in Congo around mining and the bribery and corruption and child labor that occurred in that country. And just back up a minute. So Katanga province in DRC has about 85% of the world's cobalt. It's considered one of the richest countries in terms of natural resources and contains untapped supplies of rare earth and cobalt, copper, estimated $24 trillion. That's trillion with a T. And cobalt and lithium are used in rechargeable batteries, electric motors, gas-powered cars, drones, offshore wind turbines, missiles, fighter jets, and robots, etc. So again, we took that data, tried to raise awareness in Congress and administration. Those 2 hearings, congressional hearings, focused on the DRC's heavy reliance on forced and child labor. There's approximately 25 to 40,000 children working in artisan mines, as young as 8 years old. They're smaller, they fit in the narrow shafts dug into the ground, and many die of cancer. So we did have a tragic situation, but we broadened our support with NGOs and religious groups, and particularly the Catholic Church, and got their attention in support of Congress. Some letters from the chairman and ranking member, bipartisan, as it should be, Foreign Relations Committee and other committees in the House and Senate. So the 1 was human rights. 2 was national security, and which you just touched on a little bit. Why should we care? And this was at the tail end of the last Trump administration. I remember having one of my first meetings in the White House at the Roosevelt Room with the National Security Council. And it was during COVID, so we're talking about national security, but we all had our mask on. And it was sort of hard to hear others talk with masks on, and I guess it was hard to hear some of us with our mask on. So could you speak up? Could you speak up? We can't hear you. Well, then the door flies, we're speaking up, the door flies open. I didn't know the Roosevelt Room, you might know this, is right next to the Oval Office. And somebody said, can you keep it down? The president's in there. He's not going to be happy if he has to come storming in here and tell you to pipe down. So, but that was our first conversation in the White House. During the Trump administration, we had subsequent meetings during in the Biden administration on national security. And a lot of the focus there, you talked about energy security as national security, is China. So over the past 30 years, China has emerged as a critical player in the mineral supply chain, crucial for national and energy security. And despite producing just 10% of the world's lithium, cobalt, nickel, and copper, China imports and controls the processing, basically refining, of astonishingly 70 to 90% of the global supply of these metals. And this level of control is a direct result of decades of calculated domestic industrial strategy, foreign policy, and trade policy. China's dominance presents a serious challenge to the West for two reasons. First, as geopolitical tensions arise, China has actively weaponized critical minerals, restricting exports for materials such as gallium and germanium, essential for semiconductor production, graphite used in electric vehicles, and other rare earths vital to many defense technologies. Second, China uses its market power to manipulate commodity prices, making it increasingly difficult for Western companies to compete and secure private investment. And I've seen this play out over and over again in my own practice with clients. So China's created surpluses that drive down prices, forcing Western firms to shutter operations. Now, to be fair, our own domestic policies are at fault in some instances. And there are things that we can produce efficiently in our own countries, but burdensome and unnecessary regulations stalls development of many important projects. And Western companies are generally more responsible, environmentally conscious, and attentive to human rights and labor restrictions than their Chinese counterparts. And many rare earth facilities do produce a tremendous amount of waste, in addition to radioactive elements. And the West typically views metals making as a dirty industry. And many countries have legislated heavily to restrict mining and processing of rare earths over the last decades. And sometimes we get what we ask for. And it did not matter that these resources would power a green society or the next generation of weaponry. But the issue we must be wary about is when supply chains turn unreliable, and particularly because they're controlled by countries that refuse to follow free market rules and values. This is not an isolated case where China has dominance over a strategic resource. China controls over 90% of global processing of rare earths today. It controls 70% of cobalt used in electric cars, car batteries, and smartphones and other components. The way China uses trade and investment to expand its control over resources outside its own borders is particularly concerning. For example, Indonesia has 40% of the world's reserves for nickel, the largest of any single country. Yet Chinese firms control about 75% of Indonesia's nickel refining capacity. So we need to take a hard look at the reality of the situation and develop an aggressive strategy to counter China. And just an aside, in the U.S. today, there's fewer than 700 students enrolled in mining-related fields. 700 across the country, the United States, big country. That's not a pipeline. That's a warning. So should a serious conflict between the U.S. and China arise, it's not hard to imagine, for example, in the Taiwan Strait, China could very plausibly shut off all of its exports on critical minerals to the U.S. and its allies. Japan learned this the hard way. That's simple truth, the hard way 15 years ago in 2010. China showed that it was willing to use the monopoly power over the provision and refinement of strategic resources to punish its adversaries. And again, in 2010, China cut off exports of certain rare earth elements to Japan because of a territorial dispute. Now, that only lasted 7 weeks, but they learned a lesson, and most of that today is developed. Japan and Australia developed a stronger relationship in the rare earths area, so Japan is not dependent and reliant on China. And more recently, China has restricted exports of critical minerals to proprietary refining technologies to the U.S. in retaliation for export controls and tariffs levied by both the Biden and Trump administrations. China's dominance in this space is no accident. It is a direct result of a deliberate, decades-long strategy of vertical integration backed by state financing and strategic foreign investments. just a few years ago in 2020, Xi Jinping, in a big speech, underscored that it was important for China's national security that the West supply chain remain dependent upon his country. And every effort should be made to intensify that dependence. Between 2013 and 2022, China poured $679 billion in U.S. dollars into infrastructure across 150 countries, much of it strategically targeted to support mining operations in resource-rich nations like Chile, Bolivia, and Indonesia. This approach has locked in access to critical minerals and established China as the gatekeeper of the global mineral supply chain. Today, China has 44 million metric tons of rare earth metals, the largest reserve on Earth. So what are we going to do about it? In the U.S., just in the last few months, the White House has issued a number of executive orders and repealed old ones. This includes the Trump administration's Day One executive order entitled Unleashing American Energy, which directs U.S. government agencies to assess several trade and national security related actions, including stockpiling, prioritize geological mapping, and consider support for processing of critical minerals, among other things. President Trump also issued another executive order on March 20th entitled Immediate Measures to Increase American Mineral Production. That executive order included significant measures to fast-track permitting, leasing, financing of domestic mining projects. It also directs the Export-Import Bank and the U.S. Small Business Administration to support critical minerals extraction and processing initiatives, and includes provisions designed to allocate existing federal funds and incentives to increase private sector investment in the mining industry. DOD has long, I think since World War II, been involved in critical minerals and through the Defense Production Act. That empowers the government to provide loans, loan guarantees, direct purchases to expand industrial capacity for minerals deemed critical to national defense. And U.S. Congress added the UK and Australia as domestic partners, in addition to Canada, for purposes of the DPA, Defense Production Act, so we can make direct investments in those countries. And last year, the U.S. issued multiple DPA awards to projects in Canada, which also received joint funding from the Canadian government. The U.S. DoD has already awarded close to $500 million to establish domestic rare earth element supply chains, and is now embarking on a 5-year rare earth investment strategy to build capacity. Other activities in the United States, the State Department developed a new mineral security partnership led by Secretary Rubio that aimed to diversify supply chains and reduce dependency on adversarial nations such as China. At the trade level, the USTR announced a mineral-specific bilateral agreement with Japan about 2 years ago, in which Japan hosts one of the major rare earth processing and manufacturing industries outside of China. So under the agreement, the two governments will not levy export duties on critical minerals. They trade with one another. This type of bilateral sectoral agreement to safeguard markets for minerals could be used as a model for agreements with other countries. And you also have the DFC, which is the United States Development Finance Corporation, provides funding for energy projects as part of its mission to promote economic development in low and lower middle income countries. Recently invested $30 million equity investment in Brazil for nickel and cobalt operations. In Europe, you saw President Trump recently highlight the importance, and we heard from Sir Liam earlier about the importance of Ukraine, and we still yet to see how strongly the U.S. supports Ukraine. But one of the Trump initiatives was to tie or get some benefit, I guess, with critical minerals in Ukraine. They have tremendous resources, so the president wanted to see a commercial investment or benefit from our relationship with Ukraine, which I think helps in dealing with Putin. That we had a stake in the game, stake in the ground, literally. And there's other countries in Europe with significant critical minerals. I think, Romania is an area that's had a history of significant mining, copper, cobalt reserves in the earth, and other countries in Europe. But I think there's also an opportunity not just for extraction and mining, but for the processing, which again can be often a dirty thing. We've looked in the U.S., I think, with the EPA. Too many environmental rules that won't allow us to do it under the traditional processes, but there's new processes, new technologies coming out of MIT and some other universities and companies that are cleaner versions, cleaner processing. So we'll see more of that in the future. Lastly, to ensure our own economic future and national security, we must work together to ensure that every stage of the critical mineral supply chain, from exploration and production to processing and manufacturing, remains under the control of trusted partners and allies like we have here today. So thank you.